Hi, good morning. So, first of all, are there any junior parents here today? Welcome, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. I'm even gladder you weren't here on Tuesday. Yeah. So just a couple of announcements. Yeah, I was asking myself after Tuesday, are they ever going to take me seriously again? I hope so. Or will they love me tomorrow? So just a couple of announcements. First, there were many emails regarding the response papers, whether the gratitude letter that you write, you also need to submit to your TF as the response paper. So the answer is yes and no. All right, next. Yes, you do need to submit it. However, if the letter is too personal or you don't feel comfortable for any reason submitting it to your TF as well, just send your TF a note saying, I wrote the letter, and we'll take your word for it. And so you don't have to submit it, though. Would be great if you do. The midterm is coming up in a week and a half. So just a couple of words about the midterm. What we've decided to do is to just have a multiple choice midterm. There'll be, I can't remember how many, 50 questions on the multiple choice, and you'll have the 75 minutes to do it. So we will allow for the 10 minutes or 15 minutes to get organized here. It's not going to be a difficult, trying to fool you or to catch you. It's going to be pretty straightforward. I've told you my philosophy about exams during the first class, those of you who remember. In the past, I didn't used to have exams because I remember that I wasn't happy taking exams as an undergrad, and do not do unto others. But then I realized that there was a value to them. Not a value in terms of differentiation, in grades and stuff, not that. The value is that a midterm or a final gets you to sit down and synthesize all the material. So if it was a take-home, you look for the answers where you are and you just get part of it. Whereas with a midterm or final, you sit down and you read everything from lesson 1 to lesson 26. And then that helps you synthesize and hence internalize the material. Because remember what I've mentioned time and again, this class is built around the spiral theory of knowledge. Meaning everything that we talked about in lesson 1, in class 1, is related to class 3, is related to class 7, is related to class 24. Everything is interconnected. And it's when you sit down, when I talk about the material, I know what's going to come 3 weeks from now, and I know the connection. You still don't. But when you sit down and study for the exam, that's when you get to make the connection, and that's when you really internalize the material at a much higher level. So this is why we have it. I know it's not fun. However, I think pedagogically, it is important to sit down and have a run-through, whether it's the midterm and, again, for the final. Again, won't be a difficult one, but do study for it. It will be very straightforward, fact-based. The midterm, as you can imagine, is not about showing creativity. Our goal is that you go over the material and synthesize it. If you have any questions, please email your TFs, and they'll be able to answer, or if not, they'll email me. Okay, so where were we last time? I actually can't remember. I think I repressed the whole lesson. But I was told that I skipped a few things so that I could get to the show at the end. And one thing that I skipped and I want to go back to, after we talked about the body feedback hypothesis. Do you remember the body feedback hypothesis? How you shake your hand, how you carry yourself, the facial feedback hypothesis, whether you smile, you frown. That communicates a certain message to other people who then reflect back to us. And at the same time, we're also communicating to ourselves. Am I confident? Am I proud? Or am I afraid and scared? And very often we need to, as we talked about, fake it till we make it. Because our body, our behavior sends messages to our mind, to our emotions, and affects them. was a wonderful research done by Hammerly and second author Montgomery. Hammerly and Montgomery did the following research. They recruited shy heterosexual men. Recruited them for this study, shy heterosexual men. And the study was run as follows. These men were told that the study was about taking a certain test, and they were invited into the equivalent of William James Hall, and then they were told, unfortunately, we're running behind, so you will have to wait. You will have to wait until the study actually takes place, and in the meantime, here is a waiting room, and there are other people who are waiting for the same test, and we'll come and get you. It may take a while. Sorry, we'll pay you for it, for the time that you have to wait extra. So they ended up waiting in a waiting room, and with them was waiting another person, a female, who, unbeknownst to them, was actually a Confederate, was actually a part of the study, but they thought she was just like them, waiting in line for the study to take place. So they were sitting there for 12 minutes with a woman whose instructions was to strike up a conversation with this shy heterosexual man and to express a lot of interest and excitement about what they were saying. So they were listening and they were asking questions, saying, wow, really? And they were laughing at what they were saying for 12 minutes. And then the woman went into the experiment, or so they thought, and another woman comes in, again for 12 minutes, and she sits down with the shy heterosexual man and seems very interested and laughs at what he has to say and asks questions, and so on and so on for 12 minutes. And then the next woman comes in as she goes into the experiment, and so on 6 times. 6 women sitting with a shy heterosexual man, being very interested in what they have to say, striking a conversation. 72 minutes total. And then they go into the real experiment, whatever it was. And then the next day, they're invited for the same experiment again. And once again, they go through the exact same procedure. For 72 minutes, they sit down with 6 women who are very interested in what they have to say. And of course, what really the experimenters were interested in was, what effect does this have? What effect does this behavior have on their shyness? And it had radical effects. So over the next 6 months, when they followed up on these men suddenly became far less anxious in general and specifically around women. They became less shy. These men, often for the first time in their lives, initiated relationships and started to date after 144 minutes of intervention. Radical difference, but there was a problem. What's the problem with many of these psychological experiments? That you have to debrief. Exactly. You have to debrief. So 6 months later, the study was over. The researchers invite the men in and tell them that this was just a study. And these women were actually part of the experiment. They were told to seem interested. Cruel, right? Well, less than they thought. It made no difference to these men. Because by this time, they were much more outgoing. They were doing well with the opposite sex. They were going on dates. They were less shy. It started a positive spiral. It didn't matter at all. 144 minutes changed their lives. As far as the dating was concerned, at least, if not more. Why? Think back to Bandura's work on self-efficacy. Nothing breeds success like success. When they succeeded, they did well. They saw themselves doing well. Self-perception theory, certain conclusions about who they are, what they are, and that led to an upward spiral. And continued that upward spiral. Again, we talked about fake it till we make it. We then watched Marva Collins. Chapters of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot, one of the seminal Jewish texts. Those whose deeds exceed their wisdom shall endure, but those whose wisdom exceeds their deeds, their wisdom shall not endure. If we just, remember what I talked about, if we just go to a workshop or a class and understand it on the cognitive level, even have an aha moment, a breakthrough, nothing will happen unless we follow our newfound wisdom or understanding with deeds, with action. Why? Because we first make our habits, and then our habits make us. And if we're before the workshop or class here, and then our attitude changes, but our behavior doesn't, our attitude will be pulled down over time by our habits. So it's only if we also change our habits over time. If we start doing things, if we, for example, put ourselves on the line, cope, or if we start doing the gratitude exercise or writing letters on a regular basis, or starting physical exercise, arguably the most powerful intervention to deal with anxiety, depression, as well as ADHD. Unless we start doing these things right after, the change is going to be ephemeral. We're going to go back to where we were before. Lasting, permanent change, attitude change has to be matched by deeds, by behavior. Dan Millman, I mentioned him in class a couple of weeks ago, The Way of the Peaceful Warrior, talks about the importance of action and change. He says, quote, "To change the course of your life, choose one of two basic methods. One, you can direct your energy and attention toward trying to fix your mind, find your focus, affirm your power, free your emotions, and visualize positive outcomes so that you can finally develop the confidence to display the courage, to discover the determination, to make the commitment, to feel sufficiently motivated to do what it is that you need to do. Or you can just do it." You know, sometimes easier said than done. However, very often, it's just jumping into the water. Just doing it, taking action, has the same effect as all the preparation, or even a better effect, and leads to an upward spiral. Okay, then we talked about coping and exiting your comfort zone. Parents, please close your eyes at this point. All right. And I ended by talking about attaining your optimum level of discomfort. What does this mean? What does this mean? So we can look at approaches to change or reactions to change, behavioral change, along the continuum of tension. Most of us, most of the time, are in our comfort zone. It's great, it's wonderful. However, when we're in the comfort zone, very little change happens. If we go a bit beyond that, we get to our stretch zone. This is what we call the optimal discomfort zone. This is where change actually happens. Beyond that is the panic zone. This is where we have anxiety and difficulty. This is a place that's usually unhealthy. Unhealthy for change, because very often we can go back on where we were before. You can think about this with a metaphor. The comfort zone would be freezing water. The stretch zone would be flowing water. The panic zone would be boiling water. Again, a lot of movement, but out of control and potentially dangerous. The best way to be usually is in the stretch zone. You will read about it next week when you read about flow. Flow is when you have optimal level of arousal, optimal level of tension. When the task that you're doing or whatever you're doing is not too difficult nor too easy. See, what I did at the end of last class was certainly, as I said, as you saw, I hope, out of my comfort zone. However, it wasn't enough, well, maybe, but probably not in the panic zone. Why? Because I already know you. We've been together for over a month. It's already past ad drop date, so too late for you. So I wasn't taking that much of a risk. It was just stretching. And it was important for me to, it really is personally important for me to do it, because it does stretch me and get me more in touch with my humanity. Or for example, let's say you want to start an exercise regime. You realize how important it is. You read the research. You're exposed to that research. You see it really has an important effect. And you start exercising. Well, if you haven't exercised for 5 years and you go out and start running, 8 miles a day, that's a problem. You're overstretching. You'll probably get injured. If you continue sitting in front of the TV or playing Game Boy, that's also not good for change. That's the comfort zone, perhaps, not good. Stretch would be, okay, so let me start with brisk walking for, 2 miles a day and then build it up gradually. Stretch myself, but not too much. Or if you think about starting to give lectures to others, paying it forward in positive psychology or biology or whatever your topic is, and you get anxious in front of an audience, you don't start giving a lecture in Sandra's Theater. You start initially with your friends, teammates. This is how I started with my squash teammates. I gave the first lecture to, and then I gave it to my family. Gradually, out of the comfort zone, a little bit of a stretch, and then build it over time. This is the healthful way of approaching change. Sometimes though, we have to go to the panic zone. Why? Because some things cannot be changed or almost impossible to change gradually. For example, addiction. If I'm addicted to drugs, it's very difficult to say, okay, well, today I'll have just a little bit less. I'll inject a little bit less today and a little bit less tomorrow. It usually has to be abrupt. And then we're in the boiling realm. Then we're in the panic zone, quite literally at times, which is why we need help. In this area, we need someone to hold us, someone to comfort us, someone to protect us, because it is such a volatile zone and potentially dangerous. But generally, if we want to change, the healthy approach to change would be along the stretch zone. It's impossible to change in theory. I've said this so many times, and yet very often, people who take the class, as you know, many of them do change. Many of them do say, well, my life is better today for having taken it. And other people say, well, I took the class and it didn't make a difference in my life. It was a fun experience at times, the pink shirt and others, but it didn't make a real lasting difference in my life. Almost all, not in all cases, but in almost all cases, it's because there wasn't behavioral change associated with the attitudinal change or with the insights or understandings or recognition. There has to be a bias for action. And that bias for action, just to name a few examples, to increase confidence, we do it by taking risks, not by talking and thinking about or standing in front of the mirror and saying to myself, I have a lot of confidence, I have self-esteem, I'm great, I'm terrific, I'm gorgeous. Not enough. How do we reduce stress in our lives? And we'll talk about this next week. By simplifying, by doing less rather than more. And we'll talk about how actually doing less at times doesn't just lead to more happiness, it also leads to more success, more creativity, as well as productivity. But we can't reduce the stress in theory. Chipping away through the gratefulness, creating more positive channels, becoming more of a benefit finder over time. It takes time, doesn't happen overnight. The nice thing, though, is that when we're afraid, when we think it's too much for us to take certain action, we can use our internal simulator. Remember, the mind doesn't know the difference between the real thing and the imaginary thing. And if we imagine something, if we, in the CBT language, if we engage in exposure, either through the imagination or through actual action, when we engage in exposure, over time we become more confident. Which is, as I told you, what I do, preparing for lectures, seeing myself doing it in my mind's eye, and the mind doesn't know the difference in the real and the imagined, and over time we become more confident. It's a good start, it's not enough, but certainly goes hand in hand and a very useful technique to explore and to try. So all this is well and good, and I'm sure some of you are thinking about it, and actually some came after class last time and talked to me about it and said, okay, so we know action is important, but there's a problem. And the problem is that I don't, or many people don't, have enough discipline to engage in this action, to get out and run 3 times or 5 times a week. We're lazy. It's much more fun playing with our Nintendo than going and doing yoga for an hour, at least initially. So I don't have enough discipline for change. I just want a quick show of hands here. Be honest. Put up your hand if you believe that if you had more self-discipline, now you may have a lot of self-discipline or very little self-discipline, but if you had more self-discipline, you could potentially be happier and or more successful if you had more self-discipline. Be honest. I mean, my hand is very much up. Okay, so it's most people think that. So I have good news for you and bad news for you. I'll start with the bad because I like finishing on the positive. So the bad news is you ain't going to get any more self-discipline. What you have, what you got, and what you will get. That's it. Sorry. Tough luck. Most people, overwhelming majority of people, think that they need and want more self-discipline and believe that they don't have enough. And most, just about all people, cannot get any more self-discipline. Nature, that's it. So that's the bad news. The good news, it's actually not that important. Neither for success nor for happiness. You can be more successful and happier with the self-discipline that you currently have. How? If you change your focus from relying on self-discipline for bringing about change to introducing rituals. Changing your focus from self-discipline to rituals. I'm going to talk about an idea now that is talked about in greater length in The Powerful Engagement by Jim Lohr and Tony Schwartz, an excellent, excellent book. And what they're talking about is essentially a paradigm shift. A paradigm shift where we need to stop trying to get more self-discipline because that in and of itself is not enough for success, for well-being, for change. And it's because people rely on self-discipline for change. That's the reason why most organizational as well as individual change efforts fail. So let me share with you a fun study. This was done by Roy Baumeister, one of the leading social psychologists of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century. Great researcher. Here is what he did. He brought in a group of people individually. So the person walks into the experiment, and they're told, once again, you'll have to wait in this room, a waiting room, for the experiment to start. So the person sits down. There is a table right next to that person. And on the table, there's a bowl. And in the bowl, there are freshly baked chocolate chip cookies. Just came out of the oven. Smell, the aroma, engulfing them. You know, like in those cartoons going into their nose. Phenomenal smell. They're sitting there next to the chocolate chip cookies that are in a bowl. The experimenter puts down and says, I'll come pick you up in about 10 minutes for the experiment. They walk out, and as they're walking out, they tell them, oh, and just, by the way, these chocolate chip cookies, they're for the next experiment, so if you don't mind, don't touch them. So you're sitting there, almost dying, but you're not touching it. And 10 minutes later, the experiment does come in, takes you to the experiment. The experiment is a very difficult test that you need to take. A test that most people don't solve and requires a lot of perseverance and hard work. But most people, even with perseverance and hard work, do not solve it. So the outcome measure, what the researcher is interested in, is mostly how much did you persevere before giving up on that test? How much did you persevere before giving up on that test? That was the outcome measure, the dependent variable. Second group, randomly picked, come into the same room, sit on the same chair, have the same bowl on the table. But instead of chocolate chip cookies, what they have in the bowl are red beetroots. Freshly baked. Just came out of the oven. And they're sitting there. And the experimenter is about to walk out. It says, just one more thing, if you don't mind, don't touch those beetroots, they are for the next experiment. Okay, fine. So you're sitting there for 10 minutes. 10 minutes later, the experimenter comes in, takes you to the real experiment. Sitting down, you're taking the exact same test, the exact same puzzle. And once again, how long will you persevere before giving up? Think about it for yourself for a second. Who do you think persevered more? The chocolate chip cookies group or the beetroots group? Think for yourself for a second. By the way, I guessed wrong when I was asked this question. Okay. Significantly more perseverance. Significantly more. It wasn't close. The group that had the beetroots persevered a lot more. Why? When Baumeister wanted to understand the mechanism, and he did some more experiments to explain the mechanism, it's because the chocolate chip cookie group had used self-discipline not to touch. They really wanted to touch it. But they couldn't, so they used their quota of self-discipline. And when they went into the quote-unquote real experiment, what happened was that they had little or no self-discipline left. And that maze, that experiment, that test required a lot of self-discipline. The point of this study, we all have a limited amount of self-discipline. And the question is, what do we use it on? Another question for you. How many people here have, those of you who did set New Year's resolutions, put your hand up if you're fulfilled every single one of the New Year's resolutions that you ever set for yourself. Put your hand up, every single New Year's resolution, if you did set New Year's resolutions. But higher, please. Well, I certainly didn't. But here's another question for you. How many people here, this is an important question, so please put your hand up if the answer is in the affirmative. How many people here brushed their teeth this morning? Put your hand up high. Whew, I'm glad to see this. You can all come and talk to me after, real close. So let me just imagine what happened this morning, the scenario. So you got up in the morning, you were tired, and then you said to yourself, okay, today's the day. Today's the day. I am going to do it. I am going to brush my teeth this morning. Right? And to really motivate you as you got out of bed. Here I come, Rina. Here I come to brush. And you brush your teeth, right? Today is the day. Because I have 15:04. I'm going to brush my teeth. Yes! No, of course not. You rolled out of bed, barely alive. You probably don't even remember that you brushed your teeth because you were asleep still. Now, why? Why did everyone, I hope everyone, brush their teeth this morning, whereas no one person out of more than 600 students fulfilled their New Year's resolutions? Why? Because New Year's resolutions rely on self-discipline. Brushing our teeth relies on a ritual. We do it every day. It's automatic. Now, there are rituals. We know brushing our teeth is important. People won't talk to us if we don't. But we also know that physical exercise is very important. And yet most people in the world, not at Harvard, but in the world, don't do physical exercise and pay a very high price for it. It always amazed me when people used to comment on my incredible self-discipline when I was a squash player. It always used to amaze me because I don't see myself as a person with self-discipline. You know that we don't have chocolate chip cookies at home. And if we do, Tommy hides them. Because if they were there, they would disappear 2 minutes later. Zero self-discipline when it comes to these things. And yet, with squash, I did have what people thought, was, and what I thought for many years, self-discipline. Because I would get up in the morning and go for my run. I would then go to school, and after school, straight to the course, have a session with my coach, regular session with my coach, then play games, matches, and then, as you can see, went to the gym and worked out. Every single day. And then I went home, did my homework, and went to bed. It was a ritual. That is what athletes do. They have rituals, which is why they're able to maintain what seems from the outside such high levels of discipline. At times superhuman. It's not. It's rituals. Jim Lohr and Tony Schwartz. Building rituals requires defining very precise behaviors and performing them at very specific times, motivated by deeply held values. Let me give you some personal examples. Physical exercise, deeply held value for me, has always been, and especially now when I know the research, the data on physical exercise. So I have a ritual. 3 times a week, between 30 and 45 minutes, I run. After that, do my stretching. I know how important yoga and meditation is for me. I have a ritual, and I do it. First thing when I wake up in the morning, a few deep breaths. We'll talk about it more after break. It's a ritual. Every time when I teach here, every time when I get up in front of the audience, I run before. This morning, I ran. On Tuesday, I ran twice as hard. Why? Because it releases anxiety. It helps me. Globally, generally, and specifically for the class. Another very important value for me. My wife. Our relationship. See the movie, Hitch? Fantastic movie. It's a very important value for me. And therefore, my wife and I have rituals, and we have 2 ritual dates a week. Now, when people hear it, they say, oh, come on, where is the spontaneity in love? Well, there is a lot of spontaneity in terms of what we do during these dates. But the dates are set in stone. And if I'm traveling, or my wife is traveling, and we miss a date, we make up for it after. Why? Because if we didn't have this ritual, then we'd have 2 dates a decade, as opposed to a week. And a deeply held value for both of us is our relationship. In our modern world, where there are so many conflicting demands on our time, rituals are not just important, they're absolutely necessary if we're to do the things that are important for us, that we care about. Other examples of rituals. Writing a thank you note. Once a week, once a month, making a gratitude visit. Once a month, or once every 2 months. Doing the gratitude exercise on a daily basis. These are rituals that we can introduce and can actually make an important difference. We also have a ritual dinners with the family as a whole. So every Shabbat dinner, Friday night dinner, we have together with the family. It's a ritual. It's a wonderful ritual. During the week, we also have days when we're together, because family is an important value to us. Now, sometimes, for example, because of travel or other reasons, rituals are broken. Then you can make up for it later. There can also be negative rituals. 3 hours of not checking email. I know it's hard, but it's an important ritual. And we'll talk about the effect of having our email on constantly. Because when we're constantly connected to technology, we're often disconnected from the important things in our lives. We'll talk about that after break. Rituals, introduce rituals. One of the fears that people have when they hear about rituals is that they say, well, that will take away from my productivity, and if not productivity, creativity. Not so. In fact, the exact opposite is the case. If you look, and this is historical research, if you look at all the great artists, whether it's writers, the Hemingways, or whether it's the Da Vinci's, they had a ritual in their life, and the ritual was, for example, from 7 to 10 a.m. in the morning, I write, no matter what. 6 to 10 at night, if I'm more of a night person, I paint. They had rituals, and it's because of these rituals that they were able to be creative, because then they could think about their subject material as opposed to a million other things. Well, maybe I should be doing something else, and there are other distractions. No, there was a ritual. That's what I did now.